The next day, however, Harry barely grinned once. Things started to go downhill from breakfast in the Great Hall.
The Belated Binge Podcast.
Hi, and welcome to the Belated Binge Podcast. I'm Zach, your host, revisiting some of the most iconic series in recent memory that I was incredibly late on, like our current binge of Harry Potter, where, despite being the same age as movie Harry, I didn't read this series through until my mid-20s. That's the belated part. Now we're going back, a chapter or two at a time, picking it apart, deep diving what's on the page, speculating about what isn't, particularly Dumbledore's role and his master plan. What did he know? When did he know it? And the motivations guiding the story, and of course, infusing as much sarcasm as humanly possible. That's the binge part. Together, they make the belated binge. And today, we continue our reread of Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets with Chapter 6, Gilderoy Lockhart. Before we get into it, this podcast will have spoilers. This series wrapped up in 2007. If you haven't read them by now, you're even later than I was. This podcast will also have some adult language. You can buy them in the kids section at the bookstore, but I didn't read them until I was a grown-ass man. No patrons, so no patron shoutouts. You want to change that? Check us out. Patreon.com/belatedbinge. Special announcements. If you missed the announcement on the feed that I made, I've had to push these episodes to drop bi-weekly. This, in all transparency, is a side hobby for me, and I'm also helping to raise a toddler, which doesn't leave a whole lot of time for hobbies if you're familiar with parenting. We also have just a lot of life stuff going on, and rather than giving up the podcast completely, I want to try to at least give you every other week episodes and see if I can keep up with that cadence with life happening. On another note, I've also got an announcement about our guest situation. Coming up in 2 chapters, Christina from the restricted section is going to be stopping by the binge. I am personally very excited about that. If you missed the episode of the restricted section podcast I went on discussing Veritaserum from Goblet of Fire, you should go listen to that. You can do that now and come back to finish this one, or wait until you're done here. Up to you. Now, in case you were obliviated or you got your Hogwarts letter late, last chapter, I was joined by my good buddy Garrett from the Rankum podcast to chat through the Whomping Willow, which was a complete disaster brought to us from the brain of Ronald Bilious Weasley. Harry and Ron are stopped by Dobby's extreme border control. They miss the Hogwarts Express. Harry lets Ron talk him into committing grand theft auto and flying a car without a license, which are felonies in the wizarding world, I think, punishable only by slow, painful execution if Snape had his way, which nearly happened when they landed in the Whomping Willow, which is still planted at a school where children live for some odd reason. It only takes about 14 seconds for them to get beat on a little and escape thanks to an inexplicably sentient sedan. Then, in true Gryffindor fashion, Professor McGonagall and Albus Dumbledore crush Snape's fantasy, save Harry and Ron from a fate even worse than a murder tree. Expulsion. Before we can move on and get to this week's chapter, we need to close the book on the last chapter and recap our
Expecto Plot Change-O.
This is the part of the show where we theorize on what we would expect to change in our story if we made one small adjustment to the plot of the chapter we're covering. In the last chapter, I asked, what if the invisibility booster worked on the flying car, and no muggles saw Harry and Ron in said flying car? From my perspective, not too much changes here. The stakes come down a little, but I think the outcome remains pretty much the same. Let's recap that. Harry and Ron still miss the train. Dumbledore will undoubtedly still know that they missed the train, and thus will still send Snape to go find them after missing said train. The invisibility booster doesn't make any difference to the car getting quote-unquote tired and shitting out on them, so they still fly into the murder tree. Ron's wand will still break. Snape will still be a child bully who hates Harry, so he will still read them the riot act upon their arrival. Dumbledore and Prof. McGee will still be pissed and ensure that they know how seriously dangerous and stupid their actions were. Thanks, Ron. They still won't be expelled. Snape will still cry about it. Letters will still be sent to their guardians, so Ron will still receive his howler. Pretty much everything goes according to script, except no Muggle sightings, no evening prophet, probably less fanfare when they get to their dorm, although, I don't know. Rumors, kids still arrived on a flying car. There just wasn't a newspaper clipping, so still probably a big deal. Big BFD in the eyes of the Gryffindor common room. Sure, that's probably a thing. And Arthur won't get in trouble at work. Otherwise, status quo. This time. That wraps up our chat from last chapter. So, let me get my phone out. I'm never prepared for this, by the way. Never. There's not been one time that I've just had my phone in my hand and been just ready to go with this part of the podcast. So, now that I've rambled and got my shit together here, selfie button video. Okay, we're good to go. This week's Expecto Plot Change-O question comes from Chapter 6 of Chamber of Secrets, Gilderoy Lockhart. What if Justin Finch Fletchley wasn't introduced to Harry? He was in another group entirely for herbology class. Would that change anything that comes up in this book later? Let me know your thoughts to be included in the next episode of the podcast. You can do so here on social media or by going to my website, belatedbinge.com, and leaving a voicemail. All right, so as I mentioned in the little video there, it's going to be posted on social media across Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and the TikTok. You can also respond on any of those platforms or by leaving a voicemail on my website. You know, like I said 5 seconds ago in the video. Now, onward and upward. Let's dive into the events of this week's chapter with
Priority. Incan chapter.
We've reached the point in the episode where our wands connect. Not the tips, just the streams. So we can recap what went down in the chapter that we just read. This week, I went into this remembering Chapter 6, Gilderoy Lockhart, to be, well, pretty useless. I'm not saying it doesn't serve a purpose for the book's plot or anything like that, but I didn't remember much to, like, sink our teeth into for a podcast setting, if you will. And while we could easily make this a 2-minute episode of just Ron gets a howler, we learn about mandrakes, and we have our first defense against the dark arts lesson with a new professor who proves to be an egotistical douchebag and is clearly incompetent. The end. That could be it. Because that pretty much sums up the chapter, right? Like, that's what happened. But I wouldn't do that to you. I also had forgotten some of the more foundational, important things that are laid in this chapter, aside from how bad Lockhart sucks, of course. The chapter has a lot more meat on its bones that I didn't remember from my first trip through the series, which is quite literally, aside from just wanting to do the podcast, but this was the type of stuff I wanted to do the podcast for, was to really pick the series apart as I went along on the reread and pick up on those things that I missed the first time and talk about them with you, which is what we're going to do right now, starting with that howler that I mentioned. Ron gets a letter from Molly Weasley that literally screams at him in front of everyone in the Great Hall, which is top-level embarrassment for a 12-year-old. But let's talk about howlers in general for just a second. Is this not just the Wizarding World version of, like, keyboard warriors? Couldn't anyone send a howler to anyone about anything? And couldn't you just scream, like, the nastiest shit you would never have the guts to say to that person if you were there in person? This is Twitter trolls and YouTube comments in magic form, is it not? Huh. Anyway, now, on a more serious note of how Molly uses said howler, a parent who's miles away yelling at their kid for doing something wrong. The idea makes a ton of sense. But I gotta wonder a little bit about whether the parent should want this either. Like, the child obviously doesn't want a letter sent to their school to scream at them in front of all their friends and perhaps even more importantly, they're not friends. But wouldn't I would think in many cases, screaming your family business for all to hear, like, I think about going to the grocery store, pre-COVID when you just all packed in Walmart in like sardines. Like, how annoying was it to be just hanging out in the grocery store and hear a parent just screaming at their child, like, the next aisle over? That's what this howler is, right? In a lot of cases, I would think, parents would want to at least try to kind of keep that shit behind closed doors, no? I guess on the flip side, this is... I say that, but then my next thought is going to completely contradict it in the fact that I'm surprised we don't see more of them. Because this is a school full of shithead kids. Why do we not hear about howlers going off just like every other day? Because there's enough mischief in Hogwarts to sustain a freaking poltergeist, Peeves, yet we only hear about, well, we only see Ron's howler and we hear about Neville getting one once. But we don't, in my recollection of the series, we don't encounter another student receiving one. Sure, Petunia gets one from Dumbledore much later. But I would think that this would be fairly commonplace in the Great Hall. Anyway, Ron gets his howler. It's traumatic. Oh my gosh, the world's ending. We move on to the main topic of this chapter, and that's how big of a douchebag Gilderoy Lockhart is. That's why it's named after him. And rather than going into every single act of what I'm now referring to as douchebaggery, one at a time, we're going to kind of go with the Cliff Notes version. Because honestly, that's the only way that I can stomach this chapter and talking about it with any kind of depth. I almost did 2 chapters for this episode, just so that we could basically skip through this one. Anyways, here's the beginning of our Cliff Notes on the douchebaggery from Gilderoy Lockhart. Annoying the shit out of Professor Sprout and acting like he knows more about herpology than her and announcing such to the student body. Pulling Harry aside and acting like he caused Harry to steal the car because he got a little taste for attention back at the bookstore when this guy made him come take a picture with him and completely tried to use Harry's fame to bolster his own image, but whatever, we'll probably talk more about that in a bit. And then bringing up Voldemort to Harry and his scar as a means of tracking, like, who's more famous and who gets points for what, because obviously every single adult should be trying to compete with children about their level of notoriety. Alright, now all of those come before we even get to his class. But we got to take a break for herbology before we can get to that particular class. And the whole point of this herbology lesson is to teach us what mandrakes are, which turns out to be plant-shaped babies whose cry can literally kill you, which is exactly why you should be handling these in class with 12-year-olds. Pause for dramatic effect. Aside from that child safety nightmare, there's two things that I actually did want to bring up from this. One, we learn from Hermione that mandrakes are a restorative and can return someone who's been transfigured or cursed back to their original state. And that's gonna be important, class. And might also come up a little later in this episode. Hermione also gets 10 points for knowing that information. She then gets another 10 points for knowing that the cries can kill you. Let's recap. Hermione answered 2 questions in class and got 20 house points. In our last book, Harry and Ron combined to receive 10 for saving Hermione's life from being murdered by a mountain troll. I could go on and on about this, but I won't. I'll just remind you that the point system at Hogwarts makes no sense. Moving on. We're given the, I guess, small peace of mind that our mandrakes in the story aren't quite old enough yet to kill, so that's a relief. It might just, I don't know, make you pass out or something. And then we meet a new character. Justin Finch Fletchley. He introduces himself to the trio, who he knows all by name, by their reputation. Even Ron, which is worth noting since he's usually the third wheel and always complaining about not getting any attention. But, you know, famous Harry Potter, he knows Hermione from being top of the class, and Ron, of course, it's, wasn't that your flying car? But it's a fun little moment, you know. Hermione turns red. I think Ron probably got quite excited for anyone to know of his existence. We also learn that Justin is Muggle-born, who was supposed to go to Eton, which, alright, my American is gonna be showing. And by American, I mean American, not a literal merkin. If you don't know what a merkin actually is, Google it, but not at work or in front of children. Is Eton like a snobby rich school? Or is it just a name drop to help reinforce that he's Muggle-born and he was going to go to a well-known, like, school? I don't actually know anything about Eton. I imagine it's prestigious because I've heard of it. And I don't know anything about Eton. Anyways, he's also really into Lockhart, so maybe he's a bit of a reader. But not as much as Hermione, who we learn has outlined Defense Against the Dark Arts in hearts in her notebook or planner or whatever it is that she uses. That's pretty much par for the course for a 12-year-old who has a crush on a famous person, I guess. I don't know. I guess it's hard for me to go back that far, but I seem to remember more of that with, like, classmates you had a crush on. And not to be gender specific, just so I can throw that out there. One individual instance that I can think of it personally, and this one's a little embarrassing. I remember carving my initials with a heart next to the initials of a girl that I had a crush on as a child, probably their age, into an eraser. You know, one of those, like, big art class erasers, not the teeny tiny one on the edge of a pencil, but, like, the big, thick ones. Then I forgot that I had done it, and I let my best friend borrow the eraser in art class. And he proceeded to make fun of me relentlessly for that. And then dated the girl whose initials I carved in there. I went to their wedding about 8 years later or so. It didn't work out. We kind of lost touch. But Facebook has informed me through the years that the marriage may not have lasted, but they did both move on happily into new relationships, which is great for them and has nothing to do with this podcast. Now, we meet another character, Colin Creevey, another Muggleborn, who turns out to be as obsessed with Harry as Hermione may or may not be with Lockhart. He could give Ginny a run for her money. I think Ron actually mentions that. What's the actual quote? I didn't write it down, but doesn't Ron say, let's hope that Colin doesn't meet Ginny because they could start a Harry Potter fan club or something like that? Anyways, I butchered that. He asks Harry for a picture and then asks Harry to sign it. And, of course, our favorite bully makes his appearance for the chapter. Draco just giving Harry relentless shit about signing photos, giving him shit about his scar and about Ron's family being poor. It's a real treat, a highlight of the chapter, and definitely not behavior that he's responsible for because his daddy's mean. And then Lockhart catches wind of all of this going down. And our Cliff Notes of Douchebaggery now continues. And there's a lot of these, so buckle up, kids. Forcing Harry to take a picture together for Colin and both signing it. Lecturing Harry about being a celebrity and not acting full of himself by handing out signed pictures. Making the whole class buy all of his books. Introducing himself by rattling off all of his achievements and accolades. Faking hubris. That's it. That's the whole Cliff Note there. Giving a test that's questions that are all about him. Grading said test during class and giving feedback to the students about their ability to remember useless shit about him. Dramatically revealing the Cornish pixies as if they're caged werewolves and he's a magician on stage. Letting said pixies out to destroy the classroom. Being completely incompetent and not being able to control the chaos that he let out. And running away and asking 3 students to clean up his mess. Have I captured all of the moments of douchebaggery by our buddy Gilderoy Lockhart from this chapter? If you can think of anything that I missed, please share it with me. All of the social media stuff I mentioned earlier, Belated Binge across all of them, the website, belatedbinge.com. I'm looking forward to getting some responses and having a little back and forth on whether or not you can come up with any more instances of douchebaggery from this one chapter, particularly by Lockhart. Now, Harry and Ron have already figured out that this dude's a fraud. It's right on the page. Hermione's a little slow on the uptick. She's making excuses for him because she can't see clearly through her 12-year-old crush eyes. And that's how we end the chapter. And there's a really blatant quote from Ron when Hermione mentions the stuff that Lockhart's done, and he says he's done. And that's definitely going to come up in our divination segment because it's spot on. And it pretty much it literally bookends this chapter, but it's also kind of the perfect planted synopsis of this chapter. In one little quote at the end, you pretty much get the gist of what this whole chapter was trying to tell us. And that is that this guy is full of shit. And that wraps up the chapter, bringing us to